We're now being joined by Professor Okey Ndibe, a US-based Nigerian intellectual. Among other things, he will be looking at recent developments in American democracy, transfer of power from the Republicans to Democrats, life of the diaspora African in America, an assessment of Nigeria's democratic experience, Igbo presidency challenges in the education sector, as well as COVID-19 and a lot more. Welcome to the show, Professor.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us. Professor Ndibe, let's start with your general outlook on how you're feeling about the upcoming inauguration of President-elect Joe Biden in America.
Well, as you know, America is in a rather contentious place following last November's election. So I think that we are in a rather unprecedented time in the history of the United States. And so President-elect Biden, who will be in a few hours the President of the United States, will have quite a challenge, both to unify the country and to define a different direction, a unique direction for his presidency. So it's going to be a tough task for him.
Well, quickly, as Nigerians, when we look at what has happened in the United States, we tend to think in terms of lessons. What lessons can we learn as Africans, as outsiders, looking at the American situation in terms of power, in terms of institutions, and in terms of the role of individuals in history?
Yes. Very important and also very loaded question, Ruben. I think that as Africans, one of the lessons that we ought to take from current events in America is the fragility of democracy itself. And I think that American democracy began in a dramatic way to be fragile 4 years ago when Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in the presidential contest. And there was widespread belief that perhaps the Russians had had a decisive impact on the outcome of the election. And a full-up election in which both Donald Trump and lots of Republicans believe that there has been something like the kind of systematic rigging that we associate with sort of fledgling democracies in Africa and elsewhere in the world. So I think that the most object lesson for us is that even in an established democracy like America, Republican democracy, that it takes just a few wrinkles for people to have profound disquiet and for some people to even lose confidence in the very tenets of democracy. Another lesson, of course, has to do with the limits of the individual politician. Trump came to power in the United States as an anti-establishment figure. And in a lot of ways, because he triumphed in the election in 2016, I think he came to misread the mandate that he received as one where he was going to personalize the American politics, and where he became the arbiter of what it means to be American and to be great. And I think that the loss that he suffered in November was a rebuke by Americans, and a lot of them admire him. A lot of them agree with some of the things that he did. But I think a lot of people were rubbed the wrong way with his incessant statecraft, which was a statecraft by Twitter, sort of a kind of Twitter storm presidency. And so the cult of personality, the cult of the individual, of the demagogue, I think is one of the lessons that we must push against that kind of politics in Africa. And that's sort of, sadly, the emphasis that we find, whether it's with Museveni in Uganda or with Obasanjo in his third-term bid, where some people were suggesting that if we didn't have Obasanjo, the Nigerian nation was doomed.
All right. Great analysis there, Prof. But when you look at it, this has always been America, really. I mean, and that's why I like to understand the thinking behind it. You said the mandate, he misread the mandate, but the mandate was about Trump. You know, because to my mind, Trump reminds me a lot of Papa Doc Duvalier and his Tonton Makute in Haiti and his hatchet man. It was just all about him. Real estate mogul in New York, can beat the system, get 40 years tax breaks, you can make it if you try, appears on The Apprentice, I'm the macho man American. That's it. But isn't that what America wants? Because when you say this, it's as if you're making excuses for the Proud Boys. You know, you're making excuses for the MAGAs in America. It's as if you're making excuses for them. Isn't this what America is all about? The so-called land of the free?
Well, I tell you something. I think that Trump spoke to a particular discontent in America. America has seen itself fall off as an industrial power. It remained a major military power in the world, the major strategic player in the world. But the decline of America's industrial productive sector had left a lot of everyday workers who had become middle class through working in factories and industries and so on, had made them lose a certain confidence. And here was Trump promising to restore America's greatness. And so in a lot of ways, it resonated with those who felt disenfranchised with the globalist forces that were shaping America. And so those were the people that he, if you like, used to build this coalition that ultimately found him in office. And once he was installed in office, I think that Trump began to think that he couldn't do any wrong and that he knew best. Because the way the man behaved sometimes, you saw that this was a president who took no counsel, who believed that whatever came into his mind at 3 a.m., 4 a.m., while the rest of society slept, was appropriate for him to tweet out to the world. And some of the most inane attacks on American institutions. And I'm sure that a lot of people warned him that this was not proper statecraft, but he must have assumed that if Americans elevated him to the presidency in 2016, then he and he alone could define what it means to be American and what it means to be great as an American.
Well, COVID-19, the pandemic, has been cited as a major factor in President Trump's defeat in the election, in the presidential election. But how highly will you rate the Black Lives Movement as a factor in his defeat? And then Africans are justifiably optimistic about the Biden presidency, with the hope that we'll see better relations between Africa and the United States under Biden, or we're just likely to see a continuation of the same kind of tradition?
Well, first of all, I think that the COVID crisis in America, the sort of haphazard way in which Trump addressed the COVID crisis, that he came at it as a salesman, as a purveyor of good news, you know. So the more COVID-19 ravaged and rampaged through America, the more Trump felt that he had to assure Americans that even with no action, that this disease was going to burn itself out. That kind of salesman's gusto did not pan out, so Americans punished him for it. And so this was a moment where Americans saw, dramatized for them, the particular pitfalls of the Trump style, you know. So that's one. And I think that, yes, a lot of Africans are hopeful, especially with Kamala Harris as vice president, that there will be a new and positive turn in America's relations with Africa. And I think that one of the reasons a lot of Africans don't forgive Trump is the leak of the fact that he called African countries and some Caribbean nations shithole countries. And so for a lot of us, a lot of Africans, it became personal. It was somebody had yabbed them, and they couldn't wait for him to disappear from the political space. There are so many people who sort of contributed to Biden's success. And I think that the black community is critical. The black community basically won the election for him, whether it was in Michigan or in Georgia, where the state was flipped decisively in the direction of Democrats. And I think that Biden owes a lot to the African-American community, and hopefully he'll recognize that the U.S. has its unpaid promissory note to Africa. America cannot redeem itself from its original sin, the sin of slavery, without making substantial, significant reparations to Africa.
Professor Ndibe.
And this reparation need not be necessarily in cash. Yes.
Okay, sir. Very briefly, we will take a break after this question very quickly. I just want to know, what are the key lessons that Nigerian African governments can take from? You did mention a very powerful statement earlier. You said Americans punished him for this. Let's talk about complacency and what African governments can do differently. And of course, not just the governments or voters as well when we're making our decisions. When we return, I'd like you to please answer that. Thank you, Professor, for staying with us. As I was asking earlier, could you please comment on the role of Nigerians and other Africans as well? Let's open this up in making decisions that affect their future every 4 years.
And you're talking about in America,
yes,
right?
Yes, comparatively with what we've seen in America.
Yes. Well, I think that the lesson in America, for Nigerians particularly, is the need for particular vigilance. The need for particular vigilance in the political choices that we make in Nigeria. We just came off elections 2 years ago. I think that there is a general consensus now that the political development in the country, in our country, is going in a rather disastrous direction. And I hope that in a couple of years, when Nigerians have the opportunity to make a different choice, that they will be a little more discerning in the kinds of politicians that they choose to run their affairs at every level of the society. And I was particularly moved by the NSAS movement, which was energized by young people. And I think that they showed a sense that the future must be seized by them. And I hope to see a lot more young people, principled young people, come out and participate in politics in the next round of elections.
I mean, you said something that was like music to my ears. You talked about reparations. That has been on for quite a while now, and you said that Biden should look into that. But what will be the modus operandi? You know, should it go the way of things like rewriting history, like it's currently happening in the UK and some other parts of America, where Confederate states statues are being pulled down and they are replacing them? Should that be the case? Because some other people who are saying that those Confederate statues are part of history, so you're distorting history. Should that be the way to go? Or should it be things like endowment funds and monetary rewards? Because a lot of wealth was taken. I mean, when you start to talk about the reparation narrative, look at the UK, for instance. They took most of the gold in India to develop their own country. That money has to be returned in physical terms. Should we talk about that? Or should it be in terms of things like aid? Because what we need the most here is programs that America could give to us. If I check back in living memory, it's only programs like PEPFAR that has helped Africa the most in terms of health. You know, should we have more programs like that? And AGOA and things like that, opening opportunities for African businesses and the likes. So should that be the way reparations should go? Or you've got other ideas about reparation extensively?
Actually, I don't think that the reparations that I talk about to any one mode. I think that all of the options that you listed, first of all, I also am rather ambivalent about the whole idea of pulling down statues because, you know, there has to be some rational thinking going into which statues are pulled down. I think that I would much rather erect statues to people who represent a different attitude to history, so that there is a sense of complementarity and a sense of the idea that the American history is not white, that there is an important African dimension to American history. So I think that the erection of statues to the great Africans who fought really to enable America to rise and to continue to rise to its promise is the way to go, rather than necessarily pulling down statues. I also think that direct that is targeted to critical sectors in Nigeria, for example, I think that if power right, Nigerians have the creativity, the ingenuity to just explode. To create explosive wealth. The amount of money that businesses spend on the energy sector just is crippling. So if America would invest through USAID, for example, in just boosting energy production in Nigeria and in other African countries, I think that Africans have the capacity to really reinvent themselves in a very profound and positive way. The other thing that I think is key is for America to begin to insist on the expansion of human rights in African countries, for America to reject any results from elections that are not transparent and not credible. The fact that some sit-down demagogue rigs elections, and there is some noise, but ultimately that election is accepted, and they are imprimatur. That ought to change, because Africa has, if you take Nigeria has really enlightened and visionary people who, if they were to operate in a level playing field, can change the narrative of Nigeria's development and democracy. And America should be a partner, I think, with the African people by insisting that they would only recognize products of legitimate, credible elections and not some sit-down fraudsters who will rig elections.
Well, earlier on, you talked about the fragility of democracy in your preliminary comments. But we've also seen in the United States that system fighting back, being resilient and reclaiming itself through critical mass, in the society. But if you look at Africa, we've also had some elections in recent times. And you referred specifically to Uganda. Before Uganda, we had Ghana, we had Guinea, we had Côte d'Ivoire. And in all of these places, we don't see that kind of resilience that we have seen in the United States. And yet in Africa, we keep talking about the consolidation of democracy. What are those structural or systemic things that we really need to work on, not just in Nigeria, but in many of these African countries, so that our democracy can reach a level where we can see the kind of resilience that we have seen in the United States?
Well, I think that the weakness of democracy in Africa is tied to our very history. I remember interviewing Achebe years ago, and Achebe made a point that has always resonated with me, and he said that when Western nations look at African countries and say, oh, they have sort of betrayed the legacy of democracy that they had been bequeathed by Europe, that's a fallacy, because colonialism was not a democratic system. Colonialism was the worst form of imposition, of political imposition that you could have. And so the very nature of the composition of African countries, right? The fact that you have Muslims coexisting with Christians, that you have the Igbo, Yoruba, Fulfulde, Ijaw, and so on axis. And so we've come to identify, sadly, our political fortune to a desire to have somebody from our own particular area holding political office. So education is key, in my view, and it takes enlightened Nigerians, Africans from every sector to begin to deconstruct this idea that a Christian is better than a Muslim, or a Muslim is better than a Christian candidate, that an Igbo president is good for Igbo people, or a Yoruba president good for Yoruba people necessarily, that we should actually seek alliances across the religious and ethnic divides in this country. And I think that ultimately that's where some of these things, these struggles collapse. If you look at the NSAS movement, the fact that some young people lent themselves to this nefarious project of objecting to the legitimate struggle of fellow young people to achieve a better country, a country where human rights are respected. And so you heard hordes of thugs that perhaps were recruited and unleashed by the government to counteract the legitimate cries for justice in our country. So we need to begin the task, and this is where enlightened Nigerians from every sector have to participate. We have to create a more enlightened citizenry. Poverty is another key factor. The fact that in any election cycle, you have some poor men and women who go and receive 500 naira from politicians, or a cup of salt, or a small bag of rice. And they say, well, this other candidate who may be much better candidate has given me nothing, but this guy has given me a cup of rice, so I'm going to vote for him. So that politics of poverty, the fact that the middle class was decimated in Nigeria during military rule, has created a crisis of values in our country, where too many men and women have a price.
Professor, poverty definitely is an issue, and it's a very good point to touch on. There are many people who don't feel like that's not priority for them, but just want to get by. How do we begin to, just being aware of that reality, how do we begin to circumvent that for the future? We have 2023 approaching for Nigerian next elections. This is going to come to the forefront again. How do we circumvent that as a growing issue?
Well, I was speaking over the December holidays. I was speaking with a fairly young politician who was a presidential candidate in the last round of elections. And I said to him that part of the problem is that the visionary political candidates in Nigeria seem to go to sleep after an election cycle. They seem to go to sleep, and that they need to begin to work the day after an election is decided to begin to reshape the future. And so my hope is that we're going to begin, it's already late as it were, but that we're going to begin to have people, candidates especially, and not just candidates, but have Nigerians who are enlightened begin to shape the conversation, or reshape the conversation before the next election. So we have to start early, and all of us who are enlightened, who demand more and better of our country, should be involved in this challenge.
Right. We'll go to break, a quick break now, but Okay, we've got about 40 seconds, but I want to talk about the point, very important point, about balkanization of reasonable dialogue in our political sphere. And I'll elaborate more on this just to give you context. And as it even relates to America, because if there's anything Trump did, was he was able to balkanize reasonable dialogue about nationhood in America, where the country ought to go. All he just did was to constantly rally his base, as it were. But that conversation too segues into the Nigerian project as regards things like the Igbo presidency. We're talking about restructuring. I'll create more context after the break. We'll be right back. Welcome back. If you just joined us, we've got Prof Okey Ndibe, a US-based Nigerian intellectual. We're talking about, symbolism of democracy cutting across America and the Nigerian project and the Nigerian story. So like I was saying, I was talking about the balkanization of, very objective dialogue. That was the case in America. You could call it sentiment, you could call it rallying your base, but that's what is happening here too. The conversation about restructure, the polarity in the conversation about restructure. The polarity, even in the conversation about Igbo presidency or South-South presidency, as it were, and various political ambitions. And in all of this, you don't really hear objective thought processing. You don't hear the quest for getting a candidate that can change Nigeria, that has the quality to do that. All you hear is, very sentimental, divisive, tribal, and in some cases, very puerile analysis. What is happening?
Mm-hmm. Well, I agree, and part of the crisis is, of course, that we have inherited this kind of collectivity, where I remember, again, to go back to fiction, a moment in Chinua Achebe's No Longer at Ease, where the Umuofia Progressive Union meets to discuss the conviction of Obi Okonkwo for corruption. And the president of the union begins by saying, we are strangers in this place. If good comes to it, and of course this place being Lagos, if good comes to it, let us have our turn. But if bad comes to it, let it go to the owners of the town who know which gods to appease. And so that's what we've had in Nigeria, that we've, too many Nigerians have seen Nigeria. Again, to hark back to that phrase that we used to be very prevalent, talking about sharing the national cake. Nigerians don't talk about baking the cake, they talk about sharing it. And so the assumption is that Nigeria is something food that we consume. And so the more of it we get for ourselves as Igbo or Yoruba or Hausa or Ijo or Fulfulde, the better. For us. But we have to see Nigeria somehow as a project that we are developing, that we are building. And there are, I'm confident of this, enough Nigerians from every sector of the country who are enlightened enough to embrace that vision of Nigeria. Their voices need to be more felt. I thought it was a lost opportunity when too many, I would say, more enlightened candidates in the last set of elections ran for presidency at once, that they should have coalesced against one of their number to perhaps create a better impact. But again, it goes to the issue of poverty. A lot of people talk about is the turn of the Igbo to produce a president. It would be wonderful to have an Igbo president, but I tell you what's even better, to have an excellent president. Okay? So if you gave me a choice of an Igbo person who would be a mediocre president and a Fulani leader who would be enlightened and would transform the Nigerian space, including Igbo land, guess who I'm voting for? I'm voting for the Fulani candidate. So the whole idea that once we have a Yoruba running the country is good for the Yoruba, I tell people it's a disaster. When Obasanjo was president, I happened to go to AIT for an interview, and the road itself that led to AIT, which was the road that Obasanjo would take to his farm, was in such terrible shape. So at the studio, before I started the interview, I asked them, I said, how does Obasanjo go to his farm when he was president? And they said, oh, he will land at the airport and he will take a helicopter. So during the interview, I said that Obasanjo was a disaster as a president, and not just for the Igbo and Hausa and so on, he was a disaster for himself as well. So the limits, the intellectual limits of our leaders is a crisis that we must confront, and we must deconstruct, and we must critique it. And so the whole idea that, again, I'm a Christian, I'm Catholic, but I don't necessarily believe in a Catholic president. I don't believe in an Igbo president. I want a good president for Nigeria. So if that president happens to be Igbo, I will support that president, that candidate, with all my passion. But no, I'm not going to fall for somebody just because we share the same language. That's a very nativist and ultimately ignorant way to look at political development. And as I tell people, the politicians who answer to the same last name, to the same language, sorry, as we do, when they steal the resources of this country, they are not stealing it in your name. So I can't count on meeting up an Igbo politician at the airport and saying to him, you know, I'm sick. Could you give me ₦1 million for my hospital bills? They would ignore you. So why would I then support somebody just because they speak the same language as I do? So by all means, I think that we should consistently and as vociferously as possible interrogate and dismiss this idea of that somebody who speaks our language or who goes to the same church as we do is necessarily good for us as a leader.
Well, let's talk briefly about Nigerians in America. Nigerians in America have caused some excitement in recent times with reports of Nigerians being elected to positions at state levels, and President Biden naming at least 3 Nigerians to positions in his incoming team. Why does it look like it's so easy for Nigerians to do so well in the United States? Because that's the perception here now when people are excited hearing Nigerians being given prominent positions. And why is it so difficult that the same Nigerians, if they were here, would not even be able to have the same opportunities?
Yeah. Well, the Nigerian is in a lot of ways a genius, okay? It actually goes without saying, to live in the space that we inhabit, to manage and eke out a sense of life in our space. It's a miracle in itself that Nigerians are able to do it. Speaks to their great creativity, to their great power, to the great imaginative range of Nigerians. And you know, we're very competitive people. I mean, they're saying that Nigerians they carry last is actually something that we exemplify once we have a level playing field. So when Nigerians embrace crime, they excel. They beat everybody at it. Mm-hmm. When they embrace positive projects, they also excel. So what we have to do is to expand the opportunities for Nigerians to engage within their Nigerian space in positive pursuits. Because when we're engaged in negative pursuits, we can be extremely good at it as well.
Very well said, Professor. I want to deviate and talk about your literary work, particularly with a specific reference to one of your critically acclaimed works, and that's Never Look an American in the Eye. Very interesting and well done on that piece of work, sir. Let's talk about some of the parallels you could draw with that piece of work and the realities we have on ground between Nigerian immigration situations now, looking at the upcoming Biden administration.
Yes. Well, so I went to the United States more than 30 years ago at the invitation of the novelist Chinua Achebe to be the founding editor of a magazine that he established with other African intellectuals in the U.S. And once I arrived, I had a series of really extraordinary experiences, including being arrested 13 days after I arrived for bank robbery. Some black person had robbed the bank, and the police said I fit the description. And so after the success of my second novel, Foreign Gods, Inc., I felt that I should tell sort of the drama of my life in America. And so I wrote Never Look an American in the Eye. And the title, by the way, comes from advice that an uncle of mine gave me before I left to America. He said, don't look Americans in the eye because all of them carry guns. Obviously, my uncle had seen a lot of Westerns where cowboys would gather together in a bar and stare each other down and start shooting. So he thought that every American would do that, shoot at you if you look them in the eye. So that inspired the title. I think that Nigerian immigrants in America make an impact. In the state of Connecticut, where I live, for example, the most sought-after neurosurgeon is a Nigerian. And Nigerians are some of the best lawyers that you find in the United States, some of the best professors, some of the best writers, both in the United States and in the West. And so that is ultimately what gives me the confidence that when we set up a space, when we have political leadership in this country that truly desires a regeneration of Nigeria, that truly wants to take Nigeria in a positive direction, we have all the resources within our space to drive that dramatic change. And so even though Nigeria leaves you in despair, Nigeria also inspires just undying hope. And I'll incline to the hope despite the darkness and dimness, yeah?
Well, on that note, we'd like to thank you very much, Professor Okey Ndibe, for your time and for joining us on the morning show. Thank you very much indeed. Always a delight to have you on the program.